Well,
I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'd like to make a few comments on some of the detail of this bill, and initially to talk about the clause that reads as follows. This bill makes it clear that certain persons unlawfully detained by or on behalf of the Crown are and always have been, for the principal Act's purpose and the period of their unlawful detention, persons under control or supervision. Roughly translated, that means that this prisoners and victims legislation, that is the denial of any restitution to prisoners for any wrong done to them while they're in prison, will be extended to include the situation where prisoners are kept in jail longer than they ought to be. And this happens surprisingly frequently. The flip side, and to the advantage of some individuals, is of course that occasionally prisoners are released sooner than they ought to be. These are administrative errors. They ought not to happen, and I'm sure people in corrections work hard to see that they don't, but they do occur. And sometimes people are kept in beyond the expiry of their sentence for some significant periods of time. And it's interesting that we're told in the regulatory impact statement that the intention of the original legislation was that people unlawfully detained beyond their expiry date of their sentence would nevertheless be subject to this prisoners and victims claim legislation. But this insertion of this clause, as they say, is for the avoidance of doubt, because there was whether it's case law or simply an observation that perhaps could be read differently. For the avoidance of doubt, we are told that prisoners kept beyond the expiry date of their sentence will nevertheless, for that period, be subject. They cannot, any restitution paid to them for that unlawful detention will be subject to claims by any victims. Now, so the argument's been made this morning, and I don't think it's a compelling argument nor defensible, but the argument has been made running roughly like this, that people who offend and are imprisoned therefore lose their rights, or lose some of their rights beyond simply their right to their liberty. And now we see that we're told that people bring that on themselves essentially. They offend against people's property or against people physically, violently, whatever. And therefore, for the period of their incarceration, they should not be entitled to any restitution. I fail to see how you can extend that argument to say that people should not get restitution if the Crown fails in its duty to release them on the appropriate date. You can argue that the period of the sentence has been brought on the prisoner by their own actions, and quite reasonably. I fail to see how an unlawful detention beyond the term of the sentence is the fault of the prisoner, because by this reassurance, by confirming that unlawful detention is subject to the prisoners and victims claims provisions, that somehow implies it is the prisoner's fault. It is by their action that they have been unlawfully detained, and therefore they should suffer the penalties. They should be denied any possibility of restitution. And frankly, that argument makes no sense to me. And I'd be really interested to hear a justification for including unlawful detention for that period that prisoners are kept in jail when they ought not to be through no fault of their own. How is that their fault? How is it therefore that they are subject or denied any possibility of restitution for that unlawful detention? And I'd be very interested to hear exactly how that spins out in the minds of the Minister who drafted this bill. The other point I'd make is a more general point that we have in our prisons a complaints process, which is an internal complaints process managed and operated by corrections. Beyond that, there's also an appeal available to the Ombudsman's office. I think it's important to realise that there is a very low level of confidence with inmates, with their families, with other interested parties, with NGOs who observe these things. There's a very low level of confidence in that in the complaints process, to a large extent because prisoners are often in a slightly odd situation where they're having to hand a complaint to the person who they could well be one of the people they are complaining about. And that's a very perverse situation, and one I think we need to think harder about. The point being that if prisoners' complaints are not heard, and if prisoners and other interested parties are observing that the complaints process is not working, then we are more likely to get outbreaks, outbursts of violence and incidents in our prisons. And it's very hard to see in the context of this bill how re-victimising people while they're in the care of the charge of the state can be a reasonable thing to do.
I call Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Chairman.